Hello there and welcome to the video. We're just going to get right into it. I'm going to go over the epic match between Magnus Carlsen and Daniil Dubov. Now I couldn't make a video yesterday, so we are briefly going to cover the first day, the match day yesterday. And well, we'll start with this game. Magnus had the white pieces, and this is kind of the critical moment here after Magnus played knight to f5. We had the critical moment. Dubov had to play knight h5 and we have a game. White is better, but it's still a game. However, after knight g4, it's a point of no return, and Magnus very cleverly played knight takes d4, pawn takes, and e5, isolating this pawn weakness, and he's going to win this pawn. After h5, queen c4, already attacking the pawn. If you defend it, I can play rook here. I can also the c-pawn, so black can't cover the weaknesses, and Dubov in fact panicked. Well, went for some kind of counterplay here, tried to reposition the knight, but it's just too much. It's just too much. He got the pawn on f3, but Carlsen, calm as a cucumber, didn't worry. f3, if you take the pawn, queen e4, we have a queen trait. After the queen trait, I just win the pawn and queen the b pawn. Took on b5, rook e1, very sneaky. Dubov took on d3, but now rook d1. Going back, and the knight is pinned, and it's lost. So Magnus won this game. And later, he had the white pieces again. And, well, he built up a nice position. Dubov played the Scandinavian. And here after knight c5, black's position is extremely difficult. You know, this pawn is hit, the rook is caught, defending it. This is hit twice. White is very solid. He can build up as he wants. He has all the trumps. He can push a pawn, you know, on either side if he has to, if he wants to. And Dubov decided to give up some material. Magnus took the pawn on a6, won a pawn, and actually won quite easily here. Took over the a file, and Dubov tried something, you know, give up some pawn for play, but I think we don't have to go further here. Magnus is simply up 3 pawns. The counterplay is very limited, and he won quite easily. So that was day 1. So Magnus won quite convincingly, only needing 3 games. So 2.5 against half. So we move on to day 2. So Dubov needs to find his best form. Here he has the black pieces and plays the rare move h6. Knight c3 by Magnus and bishop b4. And we already had this imbalance. Dubov takes on c3, we have double pawns. And looks like he's aiming for a quick d5. He plays d6 first, and only after knight d2 he plays d5. But here, after knight e4, knight a5. And this reminded me of a famous game, which we're going to quickly look at. And it's Spraket against Smyslov. And here Spraket just played bishop to e3, and Smyslov hit him where it hurts. Can you find the move for black here? The move is bishop takes h3, and this led to an easy win for Smyslov in this candidates match. The knight is taken, we take on d4, and we land this check on f3, and the position simply crumbles. That's an expensive pawn. So I've kind of given you a hint what happened in this game. It's a slight variation of it, but it's the same pattern. But here Magnus took first on d5, and then h6. And again, the idea is when you take on h6, you open up this square. So if Daniil were to take, we're going to land this check, win the queen. So, why did Dubov miss this? Maybe it didn't, because after f5, we have 2 pieces attacked. And this is what happened. But Magnus had seen further. He played c4, attacking the queen. Queen has to move. We still have 2 pieces attacked, but we can counterattack. And that's what Magnus did. Bishop d2. Very nice. So now when you take the knight, I take your bishop. Sorry, take your knight. And I'm up a pawn. So Dubov down a pawn has to go for activity, and he does. Queen to g6. And we notice that, okay, the f-file is opened. Could be some funny business on h3. Seems like the theme, h3 and h6. In this match, queen e2, rook f4. Magnus wanted to take on e4. And here he should have played pawn to f3. Another move like takes, well, otherwise we take on e4 and we're quite safe. Here we can play rook g3. And we do remain up a pawn. This pawn is weak. White should be able to defend and win using his extra pawn. But bishop d2 by Carlsen, and now the pieces are coming in. f3, but now we can take it. The queen is attacked. And rook g4. And now all of a sudden, black is just completely winning here. Rook e1, rook f6. Setting up here nicely, queen h5. And the game actually only lasted one more move, queen e2, which allowed a very nice finish by Dubov, combining some tactics. Kind of a rook force divorce, kind of, with rook takes g3, undermining, because the queen will be lost. Another pattern here, if you take, it's going to be mate on h1, an important mating pattern. So we don't have a choice. So either we lose the queen, or we get mated. It's true that we can take here, but this is lost. So very nice finish here by Dubov. And he strikes back immediately. Let's have a look at this game. It was a queen's Indian. Bishop e4 check. And Magnus ended up in a positionally difficult position. As we see here, rook to d1, knight f1. He wants to use the weak squares here. Queen f6. Here we have trade and e5. Strong move. Queen takes, bishop takes b7. Queen g4. And after some trades, we have this position. And Magnus, well, positionally, he's worse here. I mean, white is on the open files. Passive and strange rook, the knight can come into f5, very difficult. Magnus takes a pawn at b2. But this is a very poisonous pawn. After rook d2, Magnus even blundered immediately. He played queen c3. Queen a3 is the alternative when white has a very dangerous attack after knight g4. White does knight g4 work well for the same reason that happened in the game. Queen c3, knight d1. In the other variation, if you take on g4, the same thing happens here. Now the queen is attacked. If it moves, white to move, puzzle rush, beautiful finish, queen takes d8. You have to take it, and then we give mate. And once again, it's a matter of taste. This is clean, but I like this, doubling down on the king. Checkmate. So Dubov wins. So day 2 goes to Dubov, so we need tie breaks. And boy, did we get action there. Let's get right into it. Dubov with the black pieces in this one. Again, we have the same line, but this time Dubov goes immediately d5. Knight takes. Magnus does not want the pin, gives up the pawn, but intends to take on e5 probably. But knight d4, look at that. Now if you take on c3, you're going to land on check on e2, win the queen. So Magnus took on e5 with the knight. Knight c to e2. And here Dubov took his time and he found a smashing move. So smashing it cracked my voice. Bishop takes h3, what a move. Looks like the theme of the match, take it on h3. And look at that. Takes, knight takes b3. We eliminate the bishop, we're going to land a huge check on d5. That's what he did. But he did not find the best move here. He took on a1. Knight d4. Simplifying, the queen has to move. We take the knight, Czechoslovakia, captures, fork town, take the queen, wrap a pawn. We're probably going to win quite easily. Note that bishop f4 taking the pawn. We move the knight, and we then pin the bishop, take the pawn. We're going to remain up a pawn with a great position. But he took on a1, and now Magnus started to fight back. Rook g1, he's going for counterplay. He's not going to take the knight. Knight is not going anywhere. We want active pieces. We have to try something. Queen g4, threatening mate. Dubov now opens his king. It's still hanging in the balance. Maybe he could have bailed out here. Rook takes e5, and maybe white has nothing better than perpetual. But here, knight g6, nice move. This game is so full of tactics. If we take the queen, it's going to be a check. King somewhere, and then we take the queen. This is toast. White is up all the material. So we have to give this check, and then get the knight out. And now white has a choice which rook to take. He took the one on f8, knight d4. But now the knight gets back. Queen g6, and we're winning the rook. Game over. So game one of the tiebreak. So now Dubov needs to fight back. And well, he got a slight edge here, but he had to find the move. Bishop to g2 after knight b5. Had to find the move, bishop g2, and he's doing much better. Because after he moves in and takes the pawn on b7, you can immediately take on c6. You're up a pawn, and it's very promising. Instead, he played bishop to f5. Magnus pushed him back. And look at this. Knight c5. But what's going on? The knight is attacked. It moves. And now the rook is trapped. Same thing if you had taken on b7 with the knight. Your rook is trapped. So what are you going to do? Well, Dubov defended. Knight to b6. Bishop c5. Still the rook can't move. A rook trap. Another theme of this match. Bishop takes b5. What's going on? I take your knight. Your rook is hanging. What are you going to do? Well, rook takes b7. Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff, guys. Let's go back. Here, instead of bishop takes b6, Magnus could have played a takes b5. And the match is essentially over, because rook d1, we can go for the trade. If white doesn't trade, the rook penetrates. If we trade, guess what? This knight is not coming out. We're simply going to pick up the pawn, win the knight, win the game, win the match. See you, Dubov. But no. Magnus took on b6, and this fantastic shot by Dubov. Rook takes b7. Takes, bishop takes c6. You can play rook d7, but I take this, and I get a winning pawn endgame. I will be up a pawn. Instead, we get the opposite color bishops, which sometimes can be draws. But let's go fast here. Dubov created the pass pawn on the king side. We're going really fast. So this black essentially can't do anything about this. We create a pass pawn, and then he went around the circles until he stumbled upon the idea of moving the b pawn off the board. So a lot of moves here. You know, they're playing fast, trying to get incremental, think about the position, while making moves that maybe don't matter. But eventually, he's going to push the b pawn. A lot of moves. Now finally, pushes the b pawn. So this bishop needs to stay on this diagonal. Very important, stopping the queening. But now, the king comes back. It comes back to g4, hitting the pawn. And black will be in zugzwang. He has to protect the pawn. But while he does that, the king needs to keep the white king out. But he can't do it. He has to move the king, because otherwise he loses the h4 pawn. So move the king comes in. Eventually the king gets in, nothing to be done. And then b8 queens resigns. This is game over, e7 check. And this is even mate if you try to stop the pawn. So guess what, guys? Armageddon. This is what this match deserved. And the opening, Sicilian, Rossolimo. Magnus with the white pieces. He played this a lot with black against Caruana. We're going to go to the critical position. Black has the bishop pair, but Magnus lands this pressure on d6. And here, well, we had to give up a pawn in this position, but we have the bishop pair. Instead, Dubov played deep pawn to d5, and this is basically horrible, because knight f6, and look at those dark squares. The bishop will come back. We're going to lose this pawn, And this is just horrible. But to Dubov's credit, he kept fighting. I mean, he shook his head. He's obviously lost here, but he kept fighting. He kept fighting. Remember, he only needs a draw because it's an Armageddon game. He had less time, but draw odds. And now, all of a sudden, he defended enough so that we have an endgame. He's only down a pawn. And now he's starting to threaten to liquidate all the pawns. If he can do that, it's going to be a draw. Active rook. Guess what? He gets another pawn. And this is getting really exciting. Until we have this. King d5 and bishop d4. And all of a sudden, the rook is again trapped. He wasn't careful enough. I even have a video about almost the exact same thing. A trapped rook. I'll show you that. I'll link it in the card. Very instructive. But this might be Dubov's downfall. The rook is not getting out, guys. Look at that. This is taken, covered by a pawn, covered by a pawn, covered by a pawn, pawn in the way, and king covering d4. As long as we're covering d4, the rook can't get out. So that's what happened. He kept control of d4. But here, Carlsen plays d4. He lets the rook out. He could have played king d2. And for example, he can't take on g2 because king b3, I win the rook. And if something like this, I can take it. King b3, I win the rook, I win the game. GGO. But Magnus missed this. Will it cost him the match? d4, the rook gets out. This is actually becoming drawish. Bishop d6, and here it's time for Dubov to miss a great move. He could have played bishop d5. If you take it, king e6, I'm hitting your rook, you have to move, I take your bishop, and this is hanging. And this will probably be a draw. So what happened here? d5, now Magnus is coming in, pushing the pawn, and there's no defense. And I think Dubov actually flagged here, which is not a fitting ending to this great match, but Magnus is winning on the board. But this was an epic match. I mean, just some moments there where Dubov could have saved the draw and he would have advanced. But a lot of instructive moments, and yeah, Magnus advances after this epic match with Dubov. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.